Thank you so much, Katie. Wow, I didn't know that's coming. My husband is actually here. Fun fact, people asked us what Justice Ginsburg was going to wear to our wedding, and my husband said, as long as it's not the dissent color. She did not dissent. However, there are some really important voices of dissent here on stage, and I'm really, really honored to get a chance to be in conversation with them. I want to thank Katie for that beautiful introduction. I want to thank the Aspen Institute for making space for conversations, even when they're difficult, even when they implicate people that we love or institutions that we care about. These are the important conversations we need to be having, even when they hit really close to home. So it's been over a year since the world joined into the call, first codified, first created by the activist Tarana Burke, 2 simple words, me too. And what these words did was create a space for people who had already been doing the work and people who had not yet found themselves in the work to tell their stories of pain and abuse, to find solidarity, to think about healing, to think about creating structures in which the powerful do not abuse the vulnerable, a very important part of our conversation today. It's incredible how even now, a year and a half later, that storytelling is not complete. Every day it feels like we hear new stories of long-held or recent experiences of assault. Just a couple of days ago in the pages of my magazine, we published an account from a woman who says that our president sexually assaulted her 23 years ago. There is a man, a lieutenant governor of Virginia, Justin Fairfax, that has been accused by 2 women of sexual assault. Not only does he still hold office, he recently said that he's considering running for governor. Now, we know that this kind of behavior is not limited to one party. It's not limited to one industry. It's not limited to one gender. So what we would really like to do today is to hear from folks who have been long engaged in this work. And they are engaged specifically in systems of abuse, but also in systems that seek to create the circumstances that prevent abuse, that redistribute power away from those who have held it for a long time, and lift up and give skills to people to create these kinds of spaces where we don't have to keep saying Me Too again and again, where we create a world where there is more healing and more solidarity and less of a need to unburden ourselves in pain. So I'm really looking forward to each one of our speakers today telling us a little bit about their work and their experiences. After we hear from each one of them, I'm going to lead them in a conversation, and we're going to hear from your questions. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our distinguished folks up here. Immediately to my left is Esther Chu. She's the founding member and strategic lead of Time's Up Healthcare. Yeah. Really at the intersection of everything we're talking about here, right? It was launched in 2019, and it's an arm of the existing nonprofit that you surely have heard of, Time's Up, which seeks to fight sexual harassment and gender inequality across industries at every echelon of society where we know it needs to be addressed. She's also an associate professor of emergency medicine at the Oregon Health and Science University. She's a practicing clinician. She's an NIH-funded investigator. She studied drug policy, partner violence, gender disparities in healthcare. Wow, we are so lucky to have you here. She's also the co-founder of Equity Quotient, which is metrics in healthcare, sort of measuring whether healthcare is living up to its aspirations of diversity and inclusion. And when she has spare time, not totally sure how this is possible, she writes columns for The Lancet. Immediately to her left is Nadia Musiji. She is the co-founder of Women in Engineering, which is a social enterprise that seeks to develop engineering and STEM talent among girls. How important when we think about redistributing power, redistributing skills. This group was founded first in South Africa, and now it's worldwide. She is herself an engineer, and she co-founded WomHub, which is about gender parity, does education, works in technology. She's a board director at Pegasus, which is a management consultancy. She's a member of the World Economic Forum. And she was also love these Forbes list. In 2014, Forbes named her among the 20 youngest power women in Africa. So. To her left is Katie Hood. She's the CEO of the One Love Foundation, and that educates young people on healthy and unhealthy relationships. This is a foundation that was founded in honor of Yeardley Love, who was tragically murdered by her former boyfriend while she was a student at the University of Virginia. She joined the foundation in 2014 after a distinguished time as the CEO of the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research, and she's held positions at Goldman Sachs and Bain & Company. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about engaging young people when we think about stopping these cycles of abuse. It's so, so important. And I'm also looking forward to hearing more about how technology can help us not just be a site for abuse, which we know that it is, but also be a constructive solution. That's why I'm really excited that Jess Ladd is also on stage. She's the founder and CEO of Callisto, which is a nonprofit that uses technology to combat sexual assault, to support survivors, and to advance justice. So think things like an online sexual assault reporting system. Before this, she developed a series of online services for STD prevention and control. She worked for the White House Domestic Policy Council. She was a sexual health educator. Yes, she was the co-founder of the Social Innovation Lab in Baltimore. Really do not look old enough to have done all of this. And she's received the 2018 Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship, 2018 Ashoka Fellow. She's a senior TED Fellow. We are truly in for an engaging and moving time, so please welcome our first speaker towards our conversation. Thank you.
So thank you for that introduction, and I'm so glad to be with these women on this panel, but also in this room and at this amazing conference. It's my first time here, and I said to someone earlier, I really feel like an authentic, the common thread is people wanting to help people, and I love that. There's not enough of that in the world. So anyway, before I get started on the relevance of Me Too and the work that One Love's doing, I want to tell you a little bit about how I got here. I am not a trained relationship expert. That should be the first thing that I say. Except that I have had lots of relationships, as had all of us in the room have the same set of experience. I joined after the Michael J. Fox Foundation because on May 3rd, 2010, I got a call that said, you need to get to Sharon's house, her cousin's been killed. I was on maternity leave with my third child from the Michael J. Fox Foundation. I jumped in the car, I drove down the hill, I walked in the front door, and one of my closest friends, Sharon, was sitting there with her 3 kids under 6 around her, totally white, and she mouthed the words to me, he broke down the door and he beat her to death. I remember that day. I get chills every time I tell that story. The only word that came to my head was no, over and over again, no, 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 because my brain actually didn't have a way to compute this. And I realized in the months that followed that watching my friend's family, literally at the worst moment that you could ever possibly have happen to you, to realize I'd never thought once about this issue with any depth, and I like to think deeply about a lot of things. But as I learned more about this issue and learned that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will be in abusive relationships in this world, and I hadn't spent 1 ounce of time thinking about it, that was eye-opening. And the second thing, the reason I tell this story, is having been there from the beginning, I can assure you they had no idea she was at risk. It seems unimaginable. You think if someone's going to get killed, you must have known. There must have been signs. Well, the truth is there were signs. Nobody understood what they were. Because we don't teach our kids about the signs of unhealthy relationships and abuse. So a whole front line of friends, a whole front line of family members used words like drama and crazy and too much drinking. And they didn't use the word abuse. And if they'd used the word abuse, they would have been connected to the resources they needed to save her life. So her family, at first, Joe Biden called them to offer his condolences, and they were like, she's not a domestic violence victim. Yardley was strong. She was a Division I athlete. She had lots of friends. But over time, as they realized that all the signs were there, and if a domestic violence expert had been dropped into the middle of it, they would have known exactly what to do. They realized that they were on a mission to change this for other families. And so I remember sitting with Sharon Love, Yardley's mom, when she looked at me and said, why can't we do for this issue what Mothers Against Drunk Driving did for that issue? Why can't we shift the stigma from the abused to the abuser and teach bystanders to take away the keys? And that is the orienting vision for our organization. They thought a lot about how kids wanted to learn, and to that end, our medium is film. We create fictional films and content that surprises kids. They actually enjoy participating in it. It's not a lecture, it's not a PowerPoint presentation, it's films, and then we gather them in circles to talk about what they've seen. And I wanted to bring 2 short pieces of content to show you today to give you a sense for what our approach is like. So if you could play the first video, please.
Because I love you.
Because I love you.
Because I love you.
Because I love you. This number?
Delete.
You were walking with Mark?
You should know how dumb that makes me look.
I don't care if she's your lab partner.
Why do you have texts from him? Because I love you. This Jason number?
Delete.
And Ben?
Delete.
Because I love you, I should smash your phone.
You got lucky. Because I love you. That's not love.
So the idea here was to show people the behaviors we all see every day and hear the sounds that we've all heard before in our lives and connect the dots for people, give people a new frame of reference for understanding the behaviors that honestly most of the time they've come to accept as somewhat normal. But we didn't just want to use sort of scary and dark content, we also wanted to surprise people with lighter content. So if you could play the second video, this is our couplets.
Want to hang out later?
Me and my boyfriend always have Monday fun day.
Aw. Want to hang out later?
Me and my boyfriend always have Monday fun day.
Tomorrow?
It's our Tuesday snooze day.
Wednesday?
No friends day.
So these guys are really easy to engage with. Nobody is threatened by them. Young boys and girls love them. This is our middle school curriculum now, and kids all over the country and now the world are starting to use this. And the idea is not that it's one and done. What we want is for them to continue to engage with our content, to continue to talk to each other, and to normalize a conversation that, quite frankly, I would bet nobody in this room really knows how to have around relationship health. So since we started this work, we've educated over 700,000 kids in person with our content and our workshops, and another 100 million have engaged online. We are super focused on scale. We don't think this is the only answer, but we think of this as a first aid kit that we can give to everybody. The films are on, anyone, anywhere can download them. The discussion guides are designed to teach non-experts to lead conversations about these issues. And what we're finding is that it's working. Boys and girls are engaged. Turns out everybody wants to learn how to help their friends or themselves avoid unhealthy, and they also want to learn how to build healthy. Kids also really like the fact that they have immediate skills to use in their own lives, but they're also plugged into something bigger that has a vision of changing the world. And I would say, the Me Too movement was interesting for us because I think it's one of the most important movements that has happened, and I think we'll look back and see that it was round one of hopefully it's shorter, but maybe 25 years to real substantive change. We're dealing with issues that are deeply entrenched. It's not gonna happen overnight. But these are issues that have thrived in the dark when no one is talking about them. And round one and the simplicity of Me Too was shining a light on it and showing everybody this is not just what happened to me. This is a collective story that we need to work on. And what's funny is the kids that we work with say things like, is this what it's really like when you grow up? Like, it is a lot worse than we thought. And it increases their conviction, again, boys and girls, in building something different. So when I think about round one, what does that mean? And moving on to Me Too, I think there's 5 things I would recommend and I'd love to talk about today. I do think we have to move away from banishment. And what I mean by that is, as long as we keep thinking that we're going to get rid of this person and the problem solved, we're missing the societal piece of it, and we're missing the fact that we all ignore things and accept things every day that lead to a situation where this can happen. The second thing I've already said, we need to engage boys and men, not only because they're helpers on the front line and they want to help their friends, and not all of them are committers of crimes, but because if we want real systems change, it needs to be men and women working together for it. I would say the third is we have to start these conversations early. I think relationship health education should be a K-12 priority in this country. You should teach one language that ladders up at age-appropriate ways every year. Research shows there's nothing more important for these issues and others than the health of your relationships in your lives. We've treated it like, figure it out on your own. That's not good enough. It's really not good enough. Fourth, I think a lot about parents. I have 4 kids, 12, 14, 9, and 6. And the conversations I'm able to have with them now because I'm in this space, they shock them a little bit, but I get to go early and say, this is something you're gonna see. Let's talk through how you'll deal with it. This idea of what parents can do to role play with their kids to prepare them for hard conversations and to be bystanders is really important. And finally, it's gonna take policy change too. There's no doubt the accountability needs to be greater, and we really need to, we're seeing the play out on the corporate landscape, we're gonna need law change too. But here's the thing, it might sound really ambitious, it's been done. Mothers Against Drunk Driving was one of the organizations that helped do this in this country, and I think the time is right for us all to band together now. Thanks.
Good afternoon. I wanted to share a little bit about the Time's Up organization and specifically the story of Time's Up Healthcare, why we exist and what we plan to do. I know Time's Up as a rallying cry is probably familiar to many of you, and I don't know how many of you know sort of the granular story of how it came from the Me Too movement. Of course, when Me Too exploded on the scene, its most visible proponents at that time were women in Hollywood, actresses who helped bring Harvey Weinstein's behavior to light. Does that sound familiar? And so a bunch of women, mostly in entertainment, not just actresses, but also writers and producers, started getting together and talking about what were they going to do long-term to have impact so that culture could change. And as they were thinking about what to do, they got a letter. I'm sorry, but I have a hard time talking about this without crying, although I've told this story dozens of times, and every time is going to be the one where I don't cry. And I guess it is not this time. They got a letter from farm workers, from immigrant farm workers, and these women said to them, what you experience on the film sets in Hollywood is what we experience in the field every day. But you are women of power, and we have no agency or voices. But we band together and we stand up and we see you and we hear you. And they said, we're here to support you. And if you can imagine the agency of women in the fields telling the women in Hollywood, powerful women, that they were supporting them. It was a tremendously moving moment for them, as it is for me every time I tell it. And that is what galvanized Time's Up. So the women in Hollywood who realized they have a platform, they have power, and they have money, thought, we can't just write a nice letter back. We have to do something that's meaningful. And so what those women did was they started a crowdfund source. And to this day, it's the most successful crowdfund online in the United States. It raised about $22 million in a very short amount of time, and that money, 100%, went to establish the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund so that women who have no means with which to take on these big companies and corporations can actually step forward and sue companies. And the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund has represented women across industries, and the number 2 industry that it has represented is healthcare. And that is kind of the beginning of the story of Time's Up Healthcare, because Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and Time's Up, which is actually its own foundation now that focuses on more education and advocacy, they were kind of like, what's up with healthcare, you know? Right around the time that Time's Up was gaining momentum, there was a report that came out. Have any of you read the National Academy's report? The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine came out with a report just about a year ago about sexual harassment in the sciences. And what they found was that sexual harassment, using a broad definition that includes any language or behaviors that signal that women are second-class citizens, in addition to the more overt sexual behaviors, they found that using the broad term of sexual harassment, it is rampant, it is not improving on its own, and it is most common in medicine. And if you are familiar with the culture of healthcare, you can imagine why that is. Sexual harassment thrives, and this is all described in this report. It's a 300-page report. I swear to you, it is a riveting read, and it is free online. Please read it, because if you're wondering what the impetus for this is, it is right there in the report. About 50% of medical students, female medical students, experience sexual harassment. before they've graduated from medical school. That's how common it is. And the environment in which sexual harassment flourishes is exactly healthcare. It's deeply hierarchical. It is dominated by men in the workforce, and it is male-led primarily. And pull up the website of any health center or hospital, and you will see that those components are in place. And so, the other thing the report is clear about is that we're kind of doing a miserable job addressing it. The problem is not getting better on its own. It's not improving organically. And for the most part in healthcare, we're aimed at one thing, which is to avoid litigation. It is not to improve the situation for our workforce. It is to avoid litigation and bad press. And you think of the innovators in this room and how high aiming we are when we talk about disease and healthcare and improving systems of care for patients. And then we get to a problem that is endemic across our workforce, and our goal is don't get sued. That's like saying, if this were a cancer, and I actually believe there are some great analogies with cancer here because it is a cancer to our system, our goal would be wait till it gets metastatic and then do damage control. Our goals here are subterranean, and it is embarrassing to me. The other thing this report makes clear, and although it is specific to academia, I think it is very common across really any corner of healthcare and possibly all industries. It makes clear that that we, that we do not apply any sort of systematic approach to this. You know what I mean? So think of anything else that we address in healthcare. What do we do first? Say you want to understand a problem, and I'll take anybody want to just shout out a disease? You want to do diabetes, or we can stick with cancer, stroke? Mental health, diabetes. Okay, so let's say we need to improve diabetes care at a health center. What's the first thing that you would do? I would say I want all our patients with diabetes to have very well-controlled targets. So let's aim for a hemoglobin A1C of under 6 over the next year, like a modest, We would probably want some baseline data, right? And then we'd want to incorporate some interventions, and then we'd want to know, how are we doing, right? So when it comes to sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination, we don't measure anything except really downstream. So most organizations will know the number of complaints and the number of lawsuits, and then how many settlements there were, how much they paid out. Those are our metrics. Do you want better metrics? I think almost anything you're addressing, you want metrics, and you want them to be as upstream as it is as possible. And I think the way that we innovate around sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination is to not innovate and to not put our usual problem-solving minds on it. So what is the downstream effect? So another thing from the report, we clearly lose productivity and we lose valuable portions of our workforce. So the known established outcomes for sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination are that people get discouraged at work, they check out, they have mental and physical health sequelae, and they will step out of leadership positions and actually step out of the field. And if you have ever spoken to women in healthcare who have experienced Me Too, and actually men too, you will find that that is their narrative. They do not find joy at work. They have a hard time being productive. It is also clear that it's not just the targets of harassment, it's actually their entire workforce. So if you've been on a team where somebody has been targeted for harassment, you've been in a department where harassment is rampant, or even you've been at an entire institution where harassment is rampant, you know you're not working at the top of your game. And that organization is not going to be as successful as it would otherwise like to be. So what I would like for all of us, everybody sort of talks about, well, how can I help? And there are a lot of individual day-by-day things that we can do. But I think one of the things is we have to stop talking about this like this is a woman's problem, or even like this is a target of harassment problem. This is bad for targets of harassment. It is bad in aggregate for women, but we need to talk about this for what it is, which is it is bad for the whole healthcare system, its ability to work at the top of its capacity. And if we are not working at the top of its capacity, who does it hurt? It hurts our patients. And there are very clear examples of how a toxic work environment translates to poor patient care. There is a study that just came out. Have you guys seen the study about the operating rooms? Like when there is a leader in an operating room who is who is harassing, the clinical care suffers. There's a direct line to clinical care. So look around the room right now. Who is in this room? And I give a lot of these talks, and I would say the gender makeup of this room is usually the gender makeup in this room today. And that to me is very sad, because this is not a problem for women to hear about and women to fix. This is a problem for women and men and all genders. We are all affected by it, to be clear. The work that we want to do is all affected by it. And if we all care about healthcare quality and safety, we should all be in this room. So next time you come to this, thank you to the men who are here. Thank you for the women who are here. Thank you for everyone who is here, who is something in between. Pull in the men, because they are holding the position of power. They need to be here if they actually care about the outcomes that they're talking about. So I'll talk more about this on the panel, but Time's Up Healthcare is trying to bring everyone to the table, and we are particularly focused on the levers in healthcare, the big organizations, the processes like accreditation, God bless you, accreditation processes, everywhere that there is a lever of change, the funding mechanisms, the education mechanisms, that's where Time's Up Healthcare is, to have these conversations and explain the fundamental impetus behind change to a more equitable and safe environment. Thank you.
So this is like a tough session. I just want to acknowledge that, and I'm about to get into talking about rape, so I'm about to make it even tougher. So I want to start out with like a couple uppers. The first is that sexual assault survivors are the strongest people I know. And I think that's sometimes shown as a like unfortunate character development plot device in Game of Thrones, etc. But actually the people who are trying to solve this problem are some of the most resilient human beings on the planet. And so I have a lot of hope when it comes to addressing Me Too. I have a lot of hope that now that we are feeling less alone and that we're finding each other and that we're able to talk about what happened to us, that we don't quit. And second, I just want to point out that like, as depressing as sexual assault and relationship violence, all this is, I think it's often so hard because the other side's so great, because sexuality is such a wonderful part of our lives and can be. And healthy relationships feed us, and intimacy is fantastic. And so as much as this is hard, it's the shadow side of something that feeds us. And that's beautiful, and it's not worth forgetting that exists out there too. So first I want to talk about kind of the journey for a lot of survivors. There's no one way that people who have experienced sexual assault handle it afterwards, but there is sort of some common patterns that I want to talk about. The first tends to be an incident that was sexual and that you don't feel good about. You don't always necessarily know why, it just feels off, it just felt kind of wrong. Then often later, sometimes months, sometimes years later, there's a moment of realization. There's a moment where you get suddenly angry at something that you didn't really expect. It might be a friend making a joke or making a reference to the night in question. It might be seeing somebody on the street and you start to question, like, whoa, why did I just blow up right there? And then there starts to be the journey of labeling, trying to figure out, okay, that felt weird. You sort of re-examine that moment, you re-examine the incident, and you try to figure out why. And that tends to be when you start Googling things. You tend to start Googling what is sexual assault. You tend to start Googling what is sexual harassment. You tend to start Googling what is rape. And you try to figure out how to label what happened to you, which is often really hard because the internet has all sorts of confusing definitions, and the definitions are different in every state. And it's different in every workplace, it's different in every school. And so trying to label what happened to you is often extremely challenging. But let's say you do come to terms with and you see a label that you feel like, yes, that's me. Then you often have to go through the journey of what do you want to do about it? Because if you were sexually assaulted, that means the person who did it to you is a sexual assailant. And that can be really challenging when 85% of survivors know the person who did this to them. It's often a friend. It's often somebody they loved or somebody they trusted. It's sometimes a family member. It's often someone they dated. And so realizing that somebody who you trusted and knew would do that to you, to take on that label not only for yourself as a survivor, but for them as an assailant, is really hard because it causes you to question who can you trust. And that's very scary. And if finally you've gone through all that, you might decide that you want to report. And less than a third of survivors ever decide that they want to report to anyone. Less than 10% of college survivors ever do. Because going in to actually say, yes, I want to hold this individual who maybe I loved, who maybe I trusted, who I probably see as a full human being, I want to hold them accountable, that's a really hard choice to make, particularly when you know it's likely that you won't be believed. Because only 6% of rapes reported to the police end with the assailant spending a single day in prison. So the math just doesn't work out for a lot of survivors. And coming forward and speaking out is often an act of activism. It's an act of martyrdom. It's an act of saying, I want to take on this risk to myself, knowing that my chances are low because I want to pave the way for somebody else. And the number one reason why survivors will go through that is to protect other people. It is one of the main motivators that gets us to speak out. It's to know that this might happen to somebody else, and maybe it already has, because 90% of sexual assaults are committed by repeat offenders, who on average commit assault 6 times, and that's just before they graduate college. So for a survivor, this worry about somebody might have done it before, might do it again, it's often a very rational worry. It is often true. But that doesn't mean that coming forward you will be believed, because often you don't have any evidence. Often it's just your word against somebody else's. And in many cases, our sort of structure of justice requires a much higher evidentiary threshold for that. And there's not a lot of other options for survivors. So the end story is that 99% of sexual assailants get away with it. And they get away with it again and again and again. And I know about this journey because I've talked to hundreds of sexual assault survivors, and I know about this journey because I went through it myself. And I ended up finding the act of reporting to be more traumatic than the original assault. And going into an institution that I thought was supposed to be there to protect me, and being told by the police that there are 2 sides to every story, and being handed a brochure on couples counseling, that broke me in a way that the assault didn't. And this act that was supposed to be about me reclaiming my sense of agency and control instead took it away all over again. So 4 years ago, my team and I launched a website designed to help people who are going through this experience, and it's called Callisto. And it's designed to help them in a few ways. One, it gives them really clear definitions of sexual assault and misconduct as applied to their local communities. We've been partnering with college campuses for the last 4 years. It helps them understand those labels so they can figure out, how do I label my own experience, at least based on the criminal or the civil definitions that are available to me. 2, it helps them understand their different reporting options. So if you do want to come forward, what process to expect, so that if you come in, you're not blindsided by what that process is. It's more likely that you'll feel empowered by an experience if it happens the way that you think it will, versus often having to go into with no understanding of what you're getting yourself into. At least now you can choose exactly what is that process that you're opting into. 3, it allows them to create a time-stamped record of what happened to them, based off of something called the forensic experiential trauma interview. And this is really important to help survivors not only process what happened to them closer to the time of the incident, but also preserve evidence when they're still deciding what to do. They're still deciding how to label their experience. They're still deciding if they ever want to come forward, being able to have that time-stamped record to rely on later. 3, or I'm at 4 now, what number am I on? 4, it allows them to directly report electronically, which can be far less intimidating than coming in person to the school or to the police or HR. And 5, it detects serial assailants. So survivors can come on, they can put in the name and a series of unique identifiers like cell phone number, LinkedIn URL, Facebook URL, Instagram handle, etc., of their assailant. And it's just held in escrow And if nobody else names the same perpetrator, nothing happens. But if somebody else does, then the survivor is notified that they're not the only one. They're put in touch with an attorney, a legal options counselor that we pay for, whose job is to, under attorney-client privilege, help them understand their different options for holding their perpetrator accountable or changing their behavior and protecting their community. And those attorneys then help connect victims of the same perpetrator together so that they can take coordinated and informed action. And sometimes that action might be just confronting their assailant and saying, never do this again, and we'll know it if you do. Sometimes that action might be going to the press. Sometimes that might be going to the police. But if they know that they're not alone, things start to change. It starts to change how you label your own experience. It starts to change your motivation to report. It starts to mean that if you come forward, you're more likely to be believed. And so knowing that you're not the only one is so essential for so many survivors. We launched this 4 years ago on college campuses, and we learned that survivors who visit Callisto websites are 6 times more likely to report. They report 3 times faster. They're 3 times more likely to seek out emotional or medical care. And we've learned that 15% of survivors that have entered into our matching escrow have learned that there's another victim of their same perpetrator. And they're able to go to the same institution at the same time. Now, this is not going to solve sexual assault. It is not going to solve it holistically or completely, but it is a first step. Because first, I think we need to figure out how do we support survivors in all of this, and that if we don't support survivors, we're never going to be able to actually address this problem. And second, I think we need to realize that interrupting the behavior of serial offenders is perhaps the most efficient way to solve this problem. Survivors are not alone. Survivors are not alone with other survivors, and survivors don't need to be alone because we can be there to support them through creating actual cultures of accountability and helping them take each day at a time and truly begin to heal and rebuild and get to those wonderful, beautiful parts of relationships and sexuality. Thank you.
Hi, I'm a little bit vertically challenged, so I'm going to stand in front of the podium so that you can see me this afternoon. So I've got this crazy theory that I've been working on, and it's called the 20% tipping point. And what that is that when I looked at the Me Too movement that started in Hollywood, it happened when about 20% of the filmmakers were female. That meant that women felt a little bit safer. They felt like that they would be heard and believed, and that what we call sometimes in corporate environment career-limiting moves wouldn't be so bad because they would have other options of people to give them choices within their careers. And when it spilled over into Silicon Valley and the tech industry, it also happened that the tech industry was reaching the 20% women within the tech and engineering sectors. And women started talking about the challenges that we face when we go and raise venture capital. And that venture capitalists were not just looking for a piece of the action in your company, but they were looking for the piece of your action. And I spent my entire life trying to get more women and girls into the engineering and technology industry, starting in South Africa across 19 countries right now, including in the US. And we were so proud of the work that we were doing. We launched a program to empower 1 million girls through STEM education at the UN. And as we were running programs at primary school, high school, university, and industry, the more we were talking to women in industry, they were talking about how they were exiting. And they were exiting because they didn't know what to do about sexual harassment in the workplace. And I ran an accelerator for female founders in Africa. We had 25 female founders from different countries on the continent. Not a single one of them out of 175 applicants for 25 slots had venture capital funding. And I thought, well, this is strange, especially when everybody says Africa is the last frontier. We need to invest in Africa. We need to create female founders. And there's so much money going into Africa. And when I started to unpack that, some of the founders said, the reason it's great that you're running accelerator programs for us. We need business advice, we need business development support, we need great mentors. But actually, can you tell me how to deal with sexual harassment? Can you tell me how to deal with the fact that a VC wants to meet me at night in his hotel room? And then I started to think about my own personal Me Too stories, my own personal stories of sexual harassment in the workplace. And I thought about how much money I'm spending and how much time I'm spending empowering women around the world to to thrive in male-dominated sectors. And I came to the conclusion that it wasn't us. The real problem was actually a problem around privilege. And the real problem around privilege was around male privilege. And in many countries, including my own and in this country, the problem was white male privilege. And the reason being is that we have this notion that white men have unlimited potential for greatness. They can go on to do anything. And so as I sat in my living room in South Africa and I watched the Kavanaugh case unfold, and they spoke about how the accusers, because the victims are the accusers, how they were believable. We like them, they're believable. The CNN anchor said, no, they're really believable. No, they're great, they are believable. We believe their story, right? Because they're blonde and they're pretty and they look like the girl next door, and we believe them. But Kavanaugh has worked so hard, okay? He's on the path to greatness. How dare we stop the train of excellence? Right? How dare you women stop that train? Right? And so it was heartbreaking to see. And they said, but it was such a long time ago. He was at college. Apparently what white American boys do in college is get drunk and rape women. And it was in the 70s. It was all about sex and rock and roll and alcohol, right? It doesn't really happen. And except I think about Brock Turner. I don't know how many know Brock Turner. I know that he was at Stanford. He was an excellent swimmer. He also raped a woman. He got 3 months in jail, slap on the wrist. Her life is forever changed. But he's a great swimmer. We cannot derail his life for an indiscretion. He's going on to greatness. He's probably going to go and work at Goldman Sachs, be an investment banker, change the world. We can't stop that train. And then I think about, in my own country, we have the most liberal constitution in the world. We have some of the best anti-discrimination laws ever written, the best policymakers. We have Nelson Mandela. Well, we had Nelson Mandela. We just don't have him anymore. We have the legacy of Nelson Mandela. Except in my country, every 26 seconds, a woman is raped. So by the end of this session, 160 women would have been raped in my country. And last year, November, a little girl, 5 years old, went to the bathroom in a restaurant in South Africa. And an 18-year-old boy followed her. And he sexually assaulted her. Except she was a little black girl, and he was a white boy. And people said, why are we making this such a big deal? Right? Women get raped in South Africa all the time. Why is this on the cover? We are all racist for calling out this poor white boy, right? He's a little bit, he's not okay. Mentally he's not okay. He's mentally not okay, yeah, because he raped a black girl. I mean, honestly, he could do so much better. Right? And then I move over across to New Zealand, where just this year, a gunman filming himself walked into a mosque. And it affects me because I'm not really emotional, but when I think about mercilessly killing women and children and men who are praying on a Friday. And he lives to tell his story, right? And he pleads not guilty in court after telling the world that he's going to go and shoot up a mosque. Right? And we give him the airtime. And you know how we give him the airtime? The newspaper shows a picture of a beautiful baby boy, blonde curly hair, blue eyes. And they go, how in the world did this beautiful child go on to shoot up a mosque? And you see, when you move into countries where your privilege is starting to be taken away, and we're moving to more equitable society, when your privilege is gone, it feels a little bit like discrimination because you're always used to being on top. So when you're no longer on top, right, it now feels like, well, the world is quite unfair towards me. Right? And so we must tell his story. Just like every gunman in the US who goes and shoots up a synagogue or in a movie theater, they always save them. And we always get to hear their story. Right? Unfortunately, a black man in this country doesn't have that privilege. He's just walking around in a hoodie and he gets shot. We don't hear the backstory. Right? And so I've been thinking a lot about this challenge. And I thought, how is it that we can actually talk about privilege and how we can change the conversation entirely? Because I've been working on empowerment a really long time. I'm tired of empowerment. I want to talk about how men can actually start to be part of the conversation to change the privilege dynamics in society. And so I was at World Economic Forum in Davos a few years ago. It was freezing cold, and I get invited to this beautiful breakfast, and it's called When Women Thrive. And I said, yeah, I want to know about how women thriving around the world. And so I go, freezing cold, and I get there and there's no breakfast. So I'm just like, false advertising. And I'm super hungry, and I sit down in the session, and there's a panel, or should I call it a manel, of 4 white men, talking about how women are thriving around the world. Because, of course, we really need the Western-centric, Caucasian, male perspective of what women are doing in the world, because otherwise we wouldn't know. And we're all polite, and we're all speaking about how we need to, fantastic Airbnb CEO, you're doing a great job, great. And I have the last question, and I'm like, what is going on? Does everybody have weird colored lenses on? Are they not seeing what I'm seeing? And so because I'm vertically challenged, I get up from my seat, I walk to the center aisle, and I put up my hand and I go, I'm sorry, just wanted a question. Did any one of you think that this is really weird, that we're talking about women thriving and none of us are women, right? And then I got shut down by the moderator, right? But, and also probably kicked out of Davos. That was the last time I got invited. But when we don't start calling out privilege, it becomes a challenge. It's actually white men's responsibility to do it. And I really love, there are a few guys that are doing it stellar. The cast of The Big Bang Theory, all my nerds in the room, Big Bang Theory, they walked off set, they said, we will not film until our female counterparts get paid the same as our male counterparts. Doctor Strange, all my Marvel nuts in the room, right? He said, I will not be your leading man until my leading lady gets paid the same way. Right? When men start to, because they do have the privilege, they can open the doors, right? When they start to open the doors, things change. And so for me, that becomes more important because I'm really tired of empowering women. I'm now teaching white men in South Africa and around the world, how is it that they can use their privilege to be able to start positive conversations and to create a more privileged and equitable society. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. I just want to stop and honor the survivors in the room, the people who are close to survivors and help share their pain. I know that doing this work can often mean having to tell your story again and again and again, or having to sit with people who are experiencing this kind of pain. And I don't think we should take that lightly. I think we should all understand that it costs people every time they stand up in front of us and excavate the inner reaches of their heart and their pain. And we're going to be talking about harnessing this momentum. We're going to be talking about constructive solutions. But I think I first want to ask, I'm struck by a couple of you talking about what it costs you personally, what it costs society, that we have not yet been able to end these cycles of abuse, that for all of our talk of empowerment and for all of the entrance of women into fields and education spheres where they weren't before, we are still dealing with this problem. So I wonder if just briefly, because I want us to be honest about it, I don't want us to be Pollyanna-ish about it. Esther, you talked about what it costs. What did it cost you to speak out, to do this kind of work?
If anybody is on social media, you can look at my Twitter account over the last 12 hours or so, and you can see what it costs to be very open about the issues faced by women, and particularly people of color. There is a reason that I am doing this work in my 40s, and that is because it is when you are in a hierarchical structure of any sort, it is very hard to be low on that totem pole and speak up. Low on that hierarchy, I should say. And when young women come to me after a devastating event of harassment or other forms of discrimination and ask me what they should do, it is still hard to know how to answer. Because if you are a young doctor or doctor in training, often your success is dependent on one or two people to give you the right recommendation to move forward. And if I say speak up, we know the reason women don't speak up is because of retaliation. That single person can block your progress. Everything you worked for and sacrificed for, and sometimes your entire family sacrificed for you, and you can jeopardize it by doing the right thing and stepping forward. I think the other thing I will say is sexual harassment is one symptom of an entire structure where women do not have representation or power or equal anything, including pay. And so when I advise women to speak up, or when I speak up about myself, I think the conversation is really integrated with issues of fairness. And some women are like, well, I haven't been sexually assaulted, so I'm lucky. I won't say anything about this pay inequity when I walked in and my exact peers making 10% more than I will. And we have to include that in the range of things that we talk about, because I'll say, I hear many, many stories because of my position in Times Up Healthcare. I hear many stories of overt sexual harassment, but I hear every day about stories of micro or macro aggressions during meetings, feeling chronically talked over, attending entire conferences where men are the keynotes, men are on all the panels, and men are leading every session, and they feel completely unrepresented there, or they're promoted years later after their exact male colleague. All of that is part of that, because when we aren't in charge and represented, we have no agency, we are undervalued literally in terms of money, that is where the other forms of harassment occur, because we cannot step in and make sure that the environments are safe. And all those things I talked about, I'm not gonna limit it to me. I will just say every woman I know in healthcare has experienced all of those things, and they're all part of the same thing. So I would say those are the costs of being a woman in this space, and sexual harassment is kind of part and parcel with that range of experiences.
So last year I was hospitalized for 4 days, and they kept doing blood tests. At some point I said to my doctor, I said, I don't think I'll have any more blood left, but also I've got a lot of work to do, so if you're not going to discharge me, I'm going to discharge myself. While this hospital is fantastic, it's no hotel, right? And he said, well, maybe you should go to Bali and take a vacation because you're just not getting better. And so from a pure physical perspective, my body was taking its toll, and the context for that is we had actually just gone through all the work that we were doing in South Africa to change the status quo for women in engineering and technology. And we had the head of the Institute of Civil Engineering in a national publication publish the sexist letter on why women are just biologically not suited to be engineers, and we should just stay at home and be mothers and cook. And essentially that was the crux of the letter. And when we spoke out about it, and we got a lot of media exposure about it, we got a huge backlash. How dare we? Right? And we'd called for his resignation, and the institute unfortunately had no choice but to fire him. And so we were called all sorts of profound names, and for some strange reason, I don't know why, but whenever they feel like women are angry, they feel like we're actually just sexually frustrated. And so we got told that I just need to get laid and get in very ugly terms, right, on social media and via email and all sorts of ways. And so, putting yourself out there to try and change the world makes you sometimes very unpopular, and it makes you tired. And in South Africa, we speak Afrikaans, and there's a word that I speak multiple languages, but only Afrikaans has been able to actually give me the word that I'm feeling. And the word is called gatvol, and which literally translates to butt full. Right? I know it's a weird word, but bum full, bum full. Okay. So I'm bum full, but it doesn't sound great in English, but hatful is the Afrikaans word, right? Because you actually get so tired of constantly having to fight the same fight, right? And so I've given up, you know, besides my health, besides my family time, besides my friends and my relationships, I've given up so much, right? And at the end of the day, you've got to ask yourself, really what am I truly fighting for? And so a lot of the times my business partner and I joke and we say, actually, we just want to go to Bali, get ourselves massaged every day and, you know, contemplate, you know, easier challenges in the world. And then we wake up to a realization that if we don't do this, if we're not going to fight this fight, if we're not going to create an environment where men become part of this conversation to change the status quo, we're going to always be fighting, right? And I don't think I'm ready for my kids to be fighting this fight. I really think that we need to get it done now.
Although you should still sometimes take a vacation.
Oh, no, Bali, yeah.
Yeah, Bali or here, there's a beautiful pool here.
We decided walking up on stage that we're going to write a book together called Exhaustion, and that every woman in this room would probably purchase it.
I think I would just very quickly say that in this work, I sit down with people every day who say, I've never told you this, but there's practically nobody that I've met who hasn't been sexually assaulted in an abusive relationship. So I'd say the exhausting part for me is why the hell is no one paying attention? And that is mentally exhausting to me, is pushing something that all of us are connected to. Why is it so hard to get people to care? Pisses me off. So that's a toll, and I get beyond it because then I think there's strategies for change. There's major systems change that needs to happen. And sometimes you change systems by taking them down, right? Our approach is going inside and trying to plant common sense in every kid in this country about the way things should be. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but we're trying to create a whole next generation. And I do think this generation is up for the challenge that actually wants things to be different. So I think these are parallel tracks, but it has been infuriating to talk to people over the years who say, oh yeah, well, domestic violence. And you're like, oh, please, you know, like these relationship health is as central to everything in our world and our communities as anything else. And we've got to treat it as the hard thing.
Are they saying it as an immutable, like if there's always going to be a domestic violence,
well,
or what does it mean when they say that?
Domestic violence?
Like,
I mean, and it
just throw
doesn't
your hands
affect
up.
that many people, or it doesn't affect people who look like me. And if I've learned anything in this work, and sometimes they're not that clear, but that's the undertone of it, it affects everybody. This is a human issue, right? So it's the frustration, I think, that takes its toll. But then when I watch young people do these programs, and they're so eager, and they come back to us and they tell us how they've taken the tools and they've helped their friends, I'm like, all right, so we're just gonna have to slow and steady, keep the head down, community by community, plant these seeds of common sense that we think are pretty key to long-term change.
Jess, you also talked about what it cost you. I wonder if you could talk about doing this work and how that feels.
Sure. So yeah, I think people disclose to you all the time, and that's people in your personal life who you never knew necessarily had these types of experiences, and that serves for, we talk about women, but a lot of guys in my life too will tell me about their having experienced sexual assault. And often they've never really told anyone that before. So you end up as a counselor to a lot of people in your life, and sometimes you're an Uber driver or like other random people who ask you, what do you do? And you tell the truth, and then you're like, oh, God. And I think the hardest ones for me of those are the parents who are trying to figure out how to protect their kids. And they ask, like, what do I do to make sure this doesn't happen to my child? And I don't know what to tell you. And like a chastity belt is not the answer. And like telling your child to never drink is not the answer. And so it's like doing this work. It's like advocating for the whole world to change, which sounds big and scary and hard, and is not a satisfying solution for anyone. So I think there's playing that kind of social support role on top of the job is really draining. And so we do self-care plans for our entire team their first month on the job. There's like a very intensive self-care plan that everybody does, and we check in on it. We're gonna have a secondary trauma and resiliency training next month for the team, and I think building in that structure for anyone doing this work is really essential to sustaining it.
It just sounds like the job never stops, that you're always engaged in this work. It's not like at the end of the day, you take off your, world-saving jacket and you just get to chill. Although I hope everyone is able to find a little bit of that space, because that self-care is important. one of the things all of you mentioned was the limit of our existing systems to respond to this problem, which is not a new problem. We might have a new language to talk about it, but the process of reporting, the systems that are meant to protect us. I think people hear words like systemic change, and they don't really know what that means, right? Culture change. This all sounds really vague. So I wonder if concretely each one of you could talk about how do we make it, now that we know that this is an endemic problem, right? Anybody who does not know this is an endemic problem probably will never understand. But there are people who have now had their consciousness raised. So if you could just distill to sort of one or two or three things to explain what is systemic change and towards what? How concretely can we make it easier for those survivors who choose to step up and put themselves on the line that way? Especially knowing that, for example, it might not make a difference. But how, for those who are not accusing presidents, Supreme Court justices, and lieutenants, governors, perhaps we can build better systems. So what do those systems look like? Esther, do you want to start?
Yeah, I sort of think of it in two ways. I mean, culture change is so overwhelming, and it's a long-term effort. And I think of it as something that might make it better for my children, but more like something that will be better for my grandchildren. And you know, in Time's Up, we think about how do we change culture and how do we change policies, both like big P and little p, like laws, but also institutional policies. And I would say we kind of have like big picture things we want to do, and then we have this sort of what I think of as coping. So we've got the systems and culture that we have. How do we do best right now, so that when people are like, what Time's Up doing, I'll say, I don't have to say, well, 40 years from now, you're going to feel our effect. You know, it's like just not inspiring. And so we try to work with the best that we have. And so the way it plays out in healthcare is I say, okay, we have this existing process called Donabedian framework. Are you guys any like sort of health quality people here who are probably super, I know you. And so, you know, where every time we want to sort of examine the quality and safety of a healthcare process, we think about sort of the structures in place, the frameworks, and the outcomes. And so this is a language of Time's Up healthcare, because most people are like, we're great at our institution, we have a really robust policy. And I say, well, if you're really working in the healthcare framework, we have to look at not just policies, but how are you implementing those policies, what are the processes, and then what outcomes are you targeting? And then part of that is also how are you improving the diversity, equity, and inclusion in your institution. And I can give you like a really specific way that we're trying to work in that in the existing system to improve these things. So, you know, the NIH right now is trying to take on sexual harassment across NIH-funded institutions and individuals. Are you guys kind of familiar with that? You know, they've sort of put out a lot of big public statements, and part of that is the whole thing, not just sexual harassment, but also these things I'm talking about, representation. So Francis Collins last week said that he will no longer serve on a manel, which was, you know, New York Times front, you know, sort of kind of news, because he's such a person of stature, and so it's kind of setting an example for many other men. But another thing that NIH is really addressing is acknowledging that it's very hard to prevent sexual harassment when one person has a grant, you know, because ultimately that PI has power over everybody in the lab. And so the way that we're trying to upend structure and culture in these little ways is encouraging the NIH to have, for example, multiple PI grants. So grants where there's not just one principal investigator, but that money and the responsibility for the grant is spread out over 2 or 3 or more people. And in that way, first of all, it's a check because peers can check each other more, but also if there's one offender who needs to be removed, the entire lab doesn't suffer, and people can continue with their mentorship, the letters of recommendation, their productivity. And so there are little things that way that in that way that you can acknowledge that hierarchies have to be dismantled in order for us to protect people against harassment, and we can start doing that sort of thing right now. And I think there are a million applications of that sort of concept.
I love that because it so much gets to the star system that helps perpetuate abuse, whose work needs to be protected, whose potential, Nadia, you talked about, needs to be nourished, and that often ends up being the same people over and over again. So do you want to jump in here? Specifically, system change, culture change. You're waving a magic wand. What does that look like?
So 2 things, right? So the one is is moving the power dynamics within, and specifically even in corporate environments, right? And the one way I've seen it done brilliantly is one of my chief engineers when I was a junior engineer. And I'd go into meetings where the client would only speak to him, even though I did all the work. So I did the presentation, client would only ask him, he would then say, Nadia, please respond. And it went on for 15 minutes like this in this three-way conversation until my chief engineer said, actually, Nadia did all the work, and so please ask her all the questions. She knows everything. Right? And so the dynamic in that room completely changed, right? Because he told, and there were two white guys, right? So they could kind of share that power, so, so he had the authority to give me the power so that I could, take ownership of this process. And he became my biggest praise singer. I mean, it's in African culture, we have praise singers. So before a leader comes out, they'll say, oh, President Ramaphosa is coming out. He's so great. He's done so much for his people. President Ramaphosa. And so we talk about having praise singers in the offices that we work where male champions are championing female careers, right? And here's Nadia, she's so great, she's done all these great things, and please let her present because she's the expert, right? And so being able to actually label ourselves, and I know women, we feel really uncomfortable labeling ourselves as experts in a room, but actually just owning those titles. And then the second one is really about how is it that we can actually use privilege to everybody's advantage, right? And I think the conversation about privilege, and I've been really fortunate over the last few months to be actually hosting sessions on having positive conversations around privilege. And I've been working with white men in South Africa specifically about how they actually see their privilege and creating empathy around it. And what's been really great is at the end of the training sessions with them, most of the men have said, you know what, I'm completely more empathetic, and I know I can't change the world. I can't maybe change my whole company, but I'm going to change my friend circle so that the language that we use is no longer kind of sexist, racist, biased, and that actually I'm going to go and find some people of color and women to talk to and make friends with, and then help to use my privilege to empower others. And that's really been fantastic.
I'm going to quote you on that praise singer trope. I love that because it reminds me of how in the Obama administration, the women would talk about how in meetings when nobody would listen to what the women had to say, a second woman would always make sure to cite her, to repeat what she said, give her credit to make sure that it wasn't ignored in the room. That kind of group solidarity is being so, so important. Concrete systemic change in the field of young people.
Yeah, if you look at the Mothers Against Drunk Driving model, they had the education and student activism piece, which we're definitely working on. But then when you get to domestic violence, there's a massive problem with restraining orders and how absolutely not helpful they are. And the whole process of reporting is completely disempowering to the victim. And honestly, you have this false idea. How many people I talk to say, but I got a restraining order. And I think, but that doesn't matter. It actually doesn't matter. So we have to look at what a restraining order really is. We also really need to teach our police about emotional abuse. It is the most damaging form of abuse, but somehow if it's emotional, it's not viewed as legitimate. And I think the earliest warning signs when you can get out easily are in the emotional abuse realm before you fall down the rabbit hole of abuse, and we just don't have enough validation of that. And then third, I would say family court. So many women who have kids stay in these relationships because they do not want to split custody with their abuser. They can't leave their kids there. They fear their kids will become victims. So that's a problem. We need to figure out, and we need to figure out the right way to do this, because fathers have rights too. And by the way, sometimes women can be abusive too. So I'm not just saying it's only women, but the number of people I talk to who are staying in situations where they've been sexually assaulted or are regularly sexually assaulted by their spouse or abused, but they will not leave because they will not risk a 50-50 custody agreement. That's a problem.
So I think if we don't create accountability, we are signaling that we don't actually mean what we say when we say we don't like rape. Like if there is no actual path to accountability, if we're not willing to hold perpetrators accountable, then there's not a lot of point for survivors speaking out, and there's not a lot of incentive for the system to change. I think there are three really concrete things that institutions can do that are pretty easy to affect that change. I think one is just transparency. Make it really clear online what your definition of sexual misconduct is, what your code of conduct is, and make it really clear what's your mechanism for reporting and creating enforcement for that. Like make it really crystal clear and then follow your own process that you have made really transparent and easy to understand. I think the second is data. I think that having high quality evaluation surveys, ideally done by a third party, because workplaces know that if their workplace is conducting the survey, like there's no way they're going to tell the truth about all this stuff a lot of the time. So having a third party who's expert at measuring this stuff actually measure how often it's happening. And not only within the workplace, but just to people who work for you or who go to your school, regardless of whether or not it's committed by somebody else who's part of your same institution. And then third, I think, is having somebody you can talk to that doesn't trigger an investigation. And as places are worried about liability, they're shutting down the avenues of support for survivors, of people who they can talk to just figure out how to label their own experience or process it or understand more what the policy or process is. So they're creating more mandated reporters. This happened on college campuses, now it's happening in the workplace, which makes it really challenging for that survivor to figure out what to do next. So if you do adopt a policy, having a third-party ombuds or something, having somebody who that people in your workplace or institution can speak to as they're trying to sort this all out, I think is essential.
Did you say, are we about to go to, okay, we have a few more minutes for me to ask you questions, which I'm happy about because I have so many more questions for you. 6 more minutes for the whole thing. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought we had 6 more minutes till we went to questions. Well, I want to make sure to hear from all of you. So there is somebody walking around with a microphone. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and please identify yourself. We have a question over here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tabitha from Kenya. When we talk about harnessing the Me Too movement right now, what I firmly believe as a lawyer is that there has to be meaningful redress for survivors. And I want to put in a context that I did not perhaps hear, which is in 2017, 2018, UNAIDS, I'm not sure how many of us know what the scandals were, with Michelle Sidibe, who was then the former executive director, trying to hide, this is so disgusting for me, complaints that had been brought to him as the executive director regarding his own deputy, and how he, in a brothers club, tried to hide what was happening and the complaints that had been made by his own deputy, against his own deputy executive director. Now, in the same 2018, the African Union Commission chairperson, Musa Faki, receives an anonymous letter in which a woman has indicated that there's sexual harassment happening at the African Union. An internal investigation happens and a report is issued. And in that report, there's acknowledgement that there's sexual violence that's happening. People are being asked to have sex for jobs, especially short-term contracts at the AU. But no perpetrator is mentioned by name in an entire report. So I just want to hear from people like Esther, who said when the letters were written by the farmers and the women in Hollywood said, what can we do for them? What can the people who are in this room do for the women who are suffering in institutions such as the UNAIDS, an institution that is supposed to be leading the fight against HIV, where we're seeing such things happen? And I'm just curious to hear from you, what can we do as the people who are here to help those women?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's an outstanding question, not an easy answer, but I would say that as a community of people who care, I think the number one thing is creating an expectation that organizations, especially large influential organizations, are going to speak to their accountability. And I will say it is natural for them not to want to. So these conversations are riddled in shame and fear, right? I mean, for both the people who are targets of harassment, the people who are perpetrating it, and then the people who are manning, isn't that terrible? I still fall to this, like, this is the problem, right? It's people in charge of the organizations. And we have to flip that where we say, we know this is a problem for every organization, no matter how good you are, no matter how well-intentioned you are. It is part of the equation of bringing people together in a workforce is that there is potential for sexual harassment. Instead of saying, we're just going to wait for something to come to our attention and then we're going to do everything that we can, I think we need to, board of directors, funders, the public that interacts with any agency or organization needs to be clear that what is the data? what are the things you're doing to prevent this problem? What are the things that you're doing to intervene in this problem? Show us your successes and where you're trying to go, and this should be part of your annual report. Every organization should have a visible public metric around the incidence of these events that they share with their shareholders, with their clients, with whatever. And this is part of what Time's Up is trying to do, is encourage places or actually create our own report card so that these things are very visible, and then you have to really answer to the people who matter around these things. But routinizing these conversations and this data rather than making them exceptional is going to be what's part of this.
It sounds like what you're saying is everybody in this room needs to be putting pressures on organizations in any lever in which you're working to make sure that that kind of accountability happens. Exactly. I want to just get one more question from the audience. I see somebody standing over here with the mic.
Hi, it's working. Hi, I'm Raj Agarwal from Philadelphia. First of all, I just want to thank Aspen Ideas and the whole panel for this session. It's absolutely phenomenal, so thank you for running this. The other comment I want to make, and then a question that I have, is this is an issue for men, for women, for children, for everyone else. This is an issue about gender equity. This is about us all being human. And it's not just a woman issue or a man issue or everything else. It's about a human issue. And on that, Dr. Chu, you made a comment about, the Donomedian framework. And we have guidelines in our clinical worlds for everything, from VTE prophylaxis to antibiotics to everything else. When I'm in situations where there are microaggressions either to my team or from others, or I am the perpetrator myself of a microaggression, what are the guidelines that are there for me to be able to act in the moment rather than going, I wish I did that?
Great question. Anyone want to jump in on that? Dr. Chu or anyone else? Katie.
I don't think there's specific guidelines in place in most places. I will tell you more and more employers are bringing our same programs that we teach high school and college kids with in to teach their own staff, because part of the first step is actually labeling the behaviors that are not acceptable. And most of the time we don't label them the same way. A taxonomy really matters for knowing and then being able to catch it and say, so I can use a personal example, like because I know my unhealthy behaviors now, I recognize them much faster when I do them, and I can say, I'm really sorry, let me back up. But if you don't have a common language and a common framework, it's really hard. I think that's work to develop that, and I don't think it's rocket science. Here's the good news. And I do think this idea of normalization, 1 in 3 women will be in abusive relationships, 1 in 4 men, 100% of us will be in unhealthy relationships, and 100% of us will do unhealthy things. We should all get used to having this dialogue about that. But the good news is, on the language and the criteria, I don't think that's hard to develop. We just have to scale it, and we have to push it out.
And I think if there's anything that we learned, that this is a problem for all of us to solve together. And since we're out of time, I just want to thank our panelists for your courage, for your strength, for your openness, for your vulnerability. I truly appreciate it, and I truly appreciate all of you for joining us today.